It is time for Up Close and Personal. For me, it is most certainly a wonderful and a great honor to be up close and personal with Reverend Dr. Allan Boesak. I remember him from past days in the boycotts, especially the 1985 boycotts, which was very rife. So just very quickly, for those who don't know, Dr. Allan Boesak is an award-winning South African theologian and political activist known for his participation in the anti-apartheid movement alongside Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. One of South Africa's leading spokespersons against the country's policy of apartheid, Dr. Allan Boesak was born in Kakamas in the Northern Cape Province on the eastern border of South Africa on February 23rd, 1946. Quite a young man I've got in the studio with me. Dr. Allan Boesak is one of the guest speakers of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign's annual Nagba rally happening this Saturday, the 13th of May, at the Castle of Good Hope. Now, the Nagba, or Catastrophe, as it is known in English, is commemorated every year on 15th May and refers to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Zionist militias to make way for the creation of Israel in 1948. Now, it brings me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Reverend Allan Boesak to the studios of Radio 786. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's a lovely raining day in Cape Town. I hope you're enjoying the rain.
Oh, I enjoy the rain always. When you come from Kakamas, where it is so dry most of the year, then the rain is always welcome. I love the rain. And I suppose that today is the turning point toward winter.
Oh, yeah.
So I think Cape Townians have to be ready for that.
Oh, definitely. You know, yesterday morning it was so misty that it was difficult to drive on the roads. But I'm glad that the rain actually took away the mist. Just made it so much easier for us. Dr. Boesak, let's start with you as the theologian and political activist known for your participation in anti-apartheid movements. Tell us more about your life as an activist. How did it all start?
Well, it started very young, actually. I was 2 years old when apartheid was declared the official policy of South Africa after the National Party won the election at the polls that white people were voting in. And so one could not grow up without an acute awareness of what this policy in its practical implications, its moral implications, its psychological implications at every level of one's life, in every area of life, what that was impacting us as black people in a way that you can just never forget. So you can't ignore it. So very early on, and in my teens, I became very much aware of what apartheid was doing. I grew up in the 1960s. 1960 was Sharpeville. I was 14 years old. Then came the Rivonia trial. Nelson Mandela and the others were sent to Robben Island. There was Portco in Paarl, not so very far from where I grew up in Somerset West by that time, because we moved from Kakamas after my dad died when I was only 6 years old, with my mom and my 7 other siblings. So, and our conversations at home, of course, were about the situation. And when you grow up that poor with a widowed mother, you know what it is to fight for every single moment of life. But on the other hand, I had a mother who was a very, very deeply, strongly faith woman. And she taught our children that if you have faith in God, and God is a God of justice and of compassion, you cannot be indifferent to the injustices that are happening, not only to yourself, but towards others especially. And so my political activism grew certainly out of my growing knowledge of the political consequences of a system like apartheid and white supremacy and racism, but it also grew out of the conviction of my faith that if you say that you believe, then you have to do something about it. And so that's how I became involved. And of course, nothing was really happening in the 1960s, because that was just after Sharpeville and the banning of the organizations, and so many people in exile and sent to prison on Robben Island, and there was this ongoing, very vicious suppression by the state. All black political activity was driven underground. But still, towards the end of the 1960s, Steve Biko appeared. Black consciousness became part of the lives of my generation, and that was a life-changing experience in just about every way. And so when and then I went and I studied in the Netherlands, and I came back in 1976, 2 weeks after Soweto blew up, and 2 weeks after that, the university students at UWC asked me to come and speak to them on the meaning of Soweto for the Western Cape and for the country. And that day, they had no hall on the campus at that time yet. They were still building buildings. They had a cafeteria, and the cafeteria turned out to be too small for the turnout of the students. So they went outside, put me on a table, and I stood on a table on the lawn and I spoke. And I suppose that day is the day that one could call my entry into the political struggle of South Africa.
Dr. Boesak, just listening to you and having started off at the tender age of 2 years old, losing your dad when you were still very young. At the age of 2 years old, that time we didn't really know much about what apartheid is all about, or why are we going through all the things that we are currently going. What made you take heed at that tender age of what apartheid is doing to the people?
Well, maybe not at 2, but certainly by the time I was 5. Kakamas is a very hot place. I mean, 40 degrees in the shade in the summer is very normal for us out there. And I remember one day walking with my father to the little shop that belonged to a white person, of course. And I asked my father to buy me a cold drink. And my father did ask the white person behind. Of course, we had to go, the shop was, of course, separated.
Yeah.
So we had to go in on the non-white side, as
the
they used to call it.
The
blankers and the
yes,
side.
definitely.
So we had to go in that side. So my father asked for a cold drink for his boy. And the guy took the cold drink off the shelf. And my father said, no, those are hot. What about those cold drinks in the cold fridge there? And he looked at us and he says, those are only for white people.
Wow.
So you're very young, but you're not stupid.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking now, then of course I was upset. I cried, I was a kid, I wanted my cold drink, I didn't want a hot one. And my father tried to explain and it didn't help. But what I'm thinking now as a father myself is what went through his mind. That humiliation, that thing to be told in front of his son, you can't have a cold drink because the cold ones are kept for white people. You black people and your thirst don't matter. So I'm worried more about, thinking about those days, I worry more about what it did to my father than what it did to me. But of course, as you grow up and you put all these experiences together, you understand and you know that one never forgets. And so all of those experiences, the little things that you didn't notice, or then you remember, they get stuck in your mind and they help shape your way of looking things. And of course, you can then either respond with a wild anger at everything that was happening, or you can say, I'm not going to deny my anger, because if oppression happens, if people are humiliated, if people are oppressed, if people are exploited, and you don't get angry as a person of faith, there's something wrong with you, and there's something wrong with your faith. But the question is not, can I control my anger or can I suppress my anger? The question is, can I channel my anger in creative ways of resisting this injustice that I now know should not be?
And it's very heartbreaking, considering the fact that we all believe in one God.
Yes.
Including those back in the apartheid days. And yet for them just to implement the apartheid system and for all of us to go through it, themselves believing in one God only.
Well, they claim to be Christians. Now I know enough to say their Christianity is not real. Their God is not the God of the Bible that we pray to. It's not the God that you pray to. That God is a God of compassion. Allah's first thing is compassionate.
Yes.
It's a merciful God. A merciful God cannot be the God of people who revel in cruelty, who revel in racism, and who revel in murdering young people and even children just to preserve their power and their privilege. So you got to come to the conclusion that either you turn around and you walk away from faith altogether, or you begin to understand what your scriptures are telling you all the time. If their God is like this, it is not God.
Yeah.
And so for me, those people who call themselves Christians, they are not Christians. That is why by the time it came to 1982, and I was then elected president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, that worldwide body to which the white Dutch Reformed churches belong in this country, declared apartheid a sin and a heresy and a blasphemy, telling them the God that you're talking about is not the God that we believe in and that we worship and that we pray to. And so we suspended their membership until they would come to the realization that what they were doing, the theological and biblical justification of apartheid, was so far off the charts, was so deeply unchristian, that they cannot remain in the fold of Christian churches until they let go of that false belief.
Indeed. Now, you showed interest in preaching at a very early age and eventually became a reverend. Tell us about the link between your life as a preacher and your activism.
Well, the story in the family goes that when I was just about 4 or 5 years old, I already showed signs of wanting to become a preacher. I knew that was true, though. I never wanted to be anything else.
Okay.
And they told me that I gathered all of the dolls of my sisters that I could find, lined them up against the wall of the house, and I would preach to my captive audience.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall at that time.
But there's another thing about my faith and the question of justice. When I was 10 years old, I ran away from home. Okay. Not because I was angry at my mom or something catastrophic had happened, but I had heard that there was a revival. People were having revival services in a tent in the Strand, not so far from Somerset West. And I took the bus and I went because I wanted to be there. I wanted to see what was happening. I mean, that's how much I was drawn to things of the faith even at that time. When my mother came home, because she worked late at Truwood, she came home after 6 in the evening, everybody was home except Allan. And my mom said, "Where is he?" Nobody knew. She ran around to the neighbors, and finally one neighbor said to her, "Oh, we saw him walking toward the bus stop with a big Bible under his arm." I was 10. So she finally found out that there was this revival service thing going on in the Strand. And she got Mr. Caboni's taxi, who lived down the road from us in Victoria Street. And he took her to the tent. And when she came there, I was standing on the table testifying to Jesus and my love for Jesus. And so when it was all over, she waited until it was done. When it was all over and we sat in the car coming back, she said to me, "You mustn't run away like that. Please tell me, and why are you doing this?" And I said to her, one day I want to work for Jesus and for our people. But what does a 10-year-old boy know about working for Jesus in your faith and fighting a system like apartheid that would be called a crime against humanity? And so many, many years later, in the 1980s, when things were so difficult, and our kids were being killed by the hundreds. You remember with the boycotts of the strikes and the fights with the police and the violence. And I was just released from Pretoria Central Prison, where I was kept in solitary confinement for over a month. And I came back and I was thinking, this is too much. And so I went to my mom and we talked, as she always does, we pray together. And I said to her, I think I must give up this thing. It's becoming too dangerous for me. And she looked at me and she says, I never wanted you to go into politics. But do you remember when you were 10 years old? You made what you said to me. She says, that was a promise, not to me, but to God. So now I'm saying to you, you must keep your promise. And throughout the years, whenever I felt it was too difficult, the road is too long, this mountain is too high to climb, the fires burning me are too scorching, I'm too tired, I can't make it. I keep thinking what my mother said to me, that when you were 10 years old, you made a promise to God, and you must keep that promise. With me, that promise was to keep on fighting until all our people are genuinely free and justice would come to South Africa.
Wow, that's quite intense. And, you know, as you mentioned, your mom reminded you of the promise that you made. Do you think you made that promise also because of what happened to you when you went with your dad to go and buy that cool drink?
I'm sure none of those things get unstuck in one's mind. All of these little things that happen to one, it helps to shape you.
Yeah.
It helps you to formulate a response. It helps you to understand. And it helps you, it gives you a very deep look into the minds and the psychology of the people who are doing this to you. And as you grow up and as you begin to understand more, and as you grow in wisdom and in political knowledge and in faith, you then can put these things together and you can formulate a coherent response. And if the response that you formulate resonates with the response of all those people around you who all want to fight for justice, who all want to see our people free, who all want to see a different South Africa, then you become an activist with a purpose. And that is a very important thing. Once you discover that you have a purpose in life, and part of that purpose, a very important part of that purpose, is fighting for justice.
Indeed. So your role in activism did not just stop with only South Africans. You have strongly voiced your position for the liberation of Palestine.
Yes.
How does the struggle of South Africa connect to that of the Palestinians?
Oh, the struggle of South Africa has always been connected to the struggle of the Palestinians. I think one of the things that Mr. Mandela said right at the start when he was released from prison, that very, very first visit that he went to the United States, and he had that famous conversation with Ted Koppel of Nightline. Now, I knew Ted Koppel because during the apartheid time, I was often on his program, sharing with American audiences what was happening in this country. So, and I knew him to be a very sharp journalist, a very tough kind of guy. And he was so respected in the United States. Here was this huge audience, and he was sitting talking to Mandela and said, well, this thing with Cuba and this thing with the Palestinians. And then Mandela said to him, well, with the thing with Cuba, you must understand, we are not allowing you to pick our friends for us. We choose our friends. And then he explained to him that with the Palestinians, this is a long-standing thing. There are bonds between South Africa's oppressed people and the oppressed people of Palestine that cannot be broken. And that's the one thing we are not giving up. I mean, and there Ted Koppel sat, and the whole first didn't know what to say. They were stunned, and then they broke out into applause. Now, I think that Mandela at that moment explained to us one of the things that kept South Africa's struggle so noble, knowing that it was a struggle for South Africa. It was never just about us. It was also for the Palestinian people. And in my view, I now look at what is happening to the people in Palestine, and I keep on saying, as bad as was apartheid for us, as cruel as it was, as absolutely brutal as it was, there are ways in which the brutality of Israeli apartheid far surpasses that of the apartheid South African brutality. They have it much worse than we are. Every black person who has the opportunity to even once, like I was allowed only to visit Palestine once. They never let me back since. But I was there. And once you step into that place, you can see immediately, this is apartheid, but this is not just apartheid. This is apartheid 10 times, 100 times worse. And there are many, many things I can talk about. The apartheid roads, you can talk about that physical wall, you can talk, but all of the things, I think, where it is so much worse for Palestinians than for black South Africans, was that, especially, not always, but especially since 1960, Sharpeville, there was a stirring in the international community about us. And by the time it came to 1976, and the world had to see what apartheid was doing to our children, that it was willing to murder innocent children for the sake of white power and privilege. And by the time we got into the United Democratic Front, we had built up an international solidarity that Palestinians never had to this day. The only people who are standing with Palestinians are oppressed people like ourselves.
Now, we spoke about your thoughts about Palestine and the fact that you were allowed to go there only once back in the days. And also the fact that you said, South Africa, we had apartheid, but Palestine's apartheid is 100 times worse than what it is in South Africa.
I think so. And one doesn't have to look far. Just look at what was happening in Palestine this very week. And the never-ending brutality and the violence targeted at people. I mean, journalists like Shireen, whose murder is the first anniversary today. Think of the young people who were being killed on a daily basis, are still being killed on a daily basis. Think of the young man sitting in a wheelchair shot by a sniper. Think of the medical person attending to the wounded in one of these violent uprisings last year, targeted by a sniper and killed. And so the Israelis can do that with an impunity that the white South Africans did not enjoy at the time. And it was not because that our uprising, our resistance was so much more intense than that of the Palestinians. I mean, they are just as intense. They are just as clear. They are immensely brave people. I look at the violence that the Israelis are throwing at them on a daily basis, and not just with guns and with rockets and with all of those things. When they begin to shoot into that open-air prison they call Gaza, where people are basically sitting ducks and defenseless. And I think of when I was there, at those checkpoints, those rows and rows and rows, older men with heart conditions falling down in the sun, mothers giving birth to babies, soldiers standing there just looking at them. Just the other day, was it sometime last year when there was, I think it was in Jenin, when those young soldiers, there were pictures of young Israeli soldiers after they hit somebody, high-fiving one another. I mean, and so there is a level of inhumanity there that matches the inhumanity of South Africans. The difference is that the inhumanity of the Israelis is being watched and nothing is done about it. They get support from Europe and especially from the United States in ways that Europe and the United States would have been ashamed in terms of South Africa. And still, it's normal. With Israel. And so in that sense, international solidarity, international indignation, international justice that the Palestinians do not seem to enjoy. They are not even allowed to have an inkling of it. That I find devastating for Palestinians, but also for myself. But it makes me even more determined Every opportunity that I get everywhere in the world, whether it is here or in Europe or the United States, we fight for Palestinians in the way that we fought for our people, because I certainly do believe South Africa, our formal apartheid is gone.
Yeah.
But we must not make the mistake to think that we are free. This is not liberation. But we will never be free as long as Palestinians are not free, is the view that I take. And I thank God that there are so many South Africans who share that view.
Dr. Boesak, as a reverend, do you think that the Palestinian struggles is only for Muslims? Or is it for everybody that needs to help the Palestinians?
Oh, it's clear. I mean, it's not just for Muslims, and nobody has ever thought. I mean, it's only stupid people in Europe who say, well, this is a struggle that Arabs might fight or Muslims might fight. What nonsense is that? We have Christians in Palestine. We have Christian churches. I have colleagues in Bethlehem with whom I have worked on a project of liberation theology last year. We have an organization called Sabil of Palestinian Christians working for the liberation of Palestine. It's just like here. I mean, for me, a march in Cape Town in those days without the presence of somebody like Hassan Solomon.
Yeah.
What is that? It's not thinkable, right? It's not possible. I remember meetings in the Samaj Center, right? Yeah, right.
That's correct.
I mean, and 1 or 2 weeks after I came back from Ottawa, where the World Alliance declared apartheid a heresy, I remember asking Dalla, if one would say in Arabic that something is heresy, what would you say? And he said, haram. And I remember working that into the speech. And I worked it up until I came to the point where I said, apartheid is heresy, apartheid is haram. And the roof came down because the people understood.
Yes, correct.
Because Ottawa and the condemnation of Christian white churches in their role for apartheid was not a Christian thing only. It was about all our people. And so the fight for Palestinian freedom and dignity and the return of the land and the return to the land and the ending of the occupation, that's a fight for every single South African who even vaguely understands what it means to fight for freedom. And we have to do it not just for ourselves, but for our children. Our children must inherit from us a legacy of compassion and concern that is about much, much more than just about us. And that if we don't keep that in mind, we will make a mistake that may become irreversible. You will be allowing a young generation to grow up steeped in selfishness and in self-centeredness and not knowing what it means to be a humanized person working for a humanized world.
Indeed. I remember those days of meetings at Samaj Center when those meetings had to be kept so quiet so that the apartheid regime did not find out. But somehow or the other, they always just knew when we were having meetings.
Oh, they
at
knew.
Samaj
They
Center.
knew. They knew. I mean, for me, the point is not that they knew. For me, the point is that they really couldn't stop it.
Yeah.
And even if they did disrupt it, they couldn't stop the next one.
No,
and they
definitely
couldn't
not.
stop the struggle. So it is. There was a power and a spirit in the way we waged our struggle. And I see that same power and that same spirit and that same determination in the people of Palestine, young and old. And it makes me cry with emotion when I see that, and it makes me so much more determined that just to simply say, as long as God gives me breath in my body, that fight will go on.
If that's for sure. And that is the sentiment of all of us. As long as we are breathing, we will help to free Palestine.
Yeah.
And like Nelson Mandela said, we can never be free until
No,
Palestine is
of course
free.
not.
Now, 75 years commemoration this year of the Nagba. Perhaps you can just explain or inform the listeners what the Nagba is.
Well, the Nakba is the catastrophe that was forced upon the Palestinian people all those years ago. In 1945, when the World War came to an end and the Western world wanted to make up for its anti-Semitism, and it wanted to make up for what the Germans, the Nazis, did to the Jews. They didn't want to keep the Jews in their countries, not in Britain, not in the US really. They said, can we find a place where we can put them all together, where they won't be under our feet all the time, reminding us of what we did to them. Yeah. And so they looked at Palestine and they said, well, that's their land. And they created Palestine. So but Palestine is an ancient land where the people had lived for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. And they came, and the Palestinians who lived there were forcibly driven out by militias from the Israeli side, Zionists, with the support also especially Britain, but also of the United States, fulfilling the promises that Lord Balfour from Britain made in 1918, that they will create a state for the Jews only. And now it has, and so whatever Palestinians had owned, they lost, they were forced out, and that's why the whole concept of the return to the land, to their land which was theirs. What was Palestine and belonged to Palestine is now what? For 98% Jewish territory. And after all these years, with settlement after settlement after settlement, there are still people who want to talk about a two-state solution that doesn't exist. Little pieces where Palestinians are allowed to live and where they live in the occupied territories. There they are completely under the yoke of the Israeli apartheid regime. It is a terrible situation to live in, and the occupation itself must be at the center of every conversation that we're talking about. So the Nakba is that catastrophe that came upon the Palestinian people, created by white supremacists to give room to Jewish racists and Zionists who today claim that as their own land, as if Palestinians never lived there, as Palestinians have no right to be there, and the Palestinians who are there can live there only by the grace of those people. That is such a travesty, and we must never forget that. That is why South Africans are thinking 75 years after the Nakba and calling it the Nakba. It is a tragedy. It is a catastrophe. It's not the creation of the Jewish state. It's the creation of the beginning of the annihilation of the Palestinian people. That's how we should think about that.
So with the struggle for Palestine's liberation happening over such a long period of time, what has been the actual challenges that has prevented a resolution for such a prominent human rights matter?
Clearly because the Western powers who control also the international institutions, like the United Nations, like the International Criminal Court, the powers who, with their economic power and their military power, pretend to care, but not really. They mouth human rights issues only when it suits them, but they have no intention to make those human rights decisions and intentions applicable to Palestinian people. That's why they sit and they watch while Israel does what it is doing. It's becoming an apartheid state more and more and more and more and more, and they're not doing anything about it. So it is that howling hypocrisy that we have to speak up against. The United States gives what, $3 trillion a year to Israel in military and other aid, and so if it were not for the U.S., Israel will crumble within a day. And so part of the job that we have to do is to continue to find our allies in the United States, in every community, and there are some in the Jewish community as well, as I have experienced in the U.S. in my time there, but to strengthen them and to support them and to work with them, to put pressure more and more and more on the U.S. until the time comes that the U.S. would find it impossible to continue with these policies in support of an apartheid system that is just a bunch of murderers in suits sitting in a so-called Knesset that they call their parliament.
Now, Dr. Boesak, unfortunately our time is coming to an end. So I'm just going to go through some of the WhatsApp messages that has come through. The first one says, Assalamu alaikum Sitara, and good afternoon, Dr. Boesak. Apartheid and discrimination was open and transparent and could be challenged with what is called the struggle and its eventual defeat in 1994. But now, 30 years later, minorities, white and coloured, are now facing the same institutionalized black racism, which uses the law the same way white apartheid used the law, in stealth and silently, to suppress and disempower the minority and thereby promoting indirectly black African supremacy. I've been told many times on social media by black racists and black supremacy that me and those like me don't belong here in Africa and should go back to where we come. My question, Dr. Boesak, are we the minorities facing a worse form of racism and discrimination in under black majority ANC rule than we did in minority white apartheid? The second one says, Assalamu alaikum Sitara and Dr. Boesak. It's such an honor to listen to you. Sure, you're really taking me on a journey of never to forget who we are and why we were created as God-loving creation. Yes, you are correct in saying apartheid was brutal and heartbreaking, but Palestine is 100 times worse and the world is deathly silent. Salams, please ask the doctor when is going to be his rightful place, a president of the country. And the last one says, Salams, Dr. Boesak is still very young at heart for his age. May he have all the strength to fight for humanity. Fight for humanity. Dr. Boesak, just your very quick, your feedback on that as we have to conclude.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for those very, very kind words. I won't take the president one very seriously, but I will work until we have a president that is worthy of the trust and the love and the support of his people. This one is not. That's all I want. He has to go as soon as possible. Secondly, let me say to the person who asked that long question about what he calls the minorities. Yeah. I've never seen myself as a minority in this country. I'm an African. I was here before anybody else came here. Part of my heritage is Khoi, the other part is San, the other part is Bantu speaking. Part of my heritage is slave heritage. We were here. This is our land. Don't let anybody tell you you're not an African. You are an African, my brother or my sister who wrote that thing. These people who want to de-Africanize us have a racist, supremacist agenda, but it's also a capitalist agenda. Because, listen, just the other day, Cyril Ramaphosa, while the ANC was trying to tell us we are not really Africans, we don't belong here, flew down to Cape Town to speak at the 100th anniversary of the Afrikaner Broederbond. And one of the most important things he told those white people from the Broederbond was that they must not worry, they are all Africans. Now, there's a reason why he would say that to them and not to us. And I refuse to allow myself to be taken away from my Africanness and my African root by these people who now call themselves Africans exclusively as if they are alone African. So don't let that happen. And with all the fights that we are fighting, all the struggles that we are having, that is part of our struggle. There is a racism in South Africa, and I know that especially so-called colored people are in a very, very difficult position. But number one, we must not allow that. We must fight them. We must tell them openly, and we must not be shy to let them know how proud we are to be Africans and that they have no right to take that away from any of us.
Indeed. I say Viva South Africa. While it is time for us to conclude, Dr. Reverend Allan Boesak, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We do wish you all the best, and we leave you in the protection of God Almighty for standing for us and for helping the people of Palestine.
Thank you, Sarita, so much. Thank you, listeners. It was wonderful to be with you all.